types of insured contracts: lease of premises, sidetrack agreement, easement or license, municipality indemnity, elevator maintenance, and tort liability. Okay, so going through each one of these. Lease of premises. When you think about, for example, a lease of premises, think about the owner of the building and the landlord. So for example, in my agency, I rented my building. I didn't own it. And so my landlord, of course, asked for this, and most landlords do, because what they're doing is when you have a contract and you have a landlord and a tenant, there are certain responsibilities that the tenant has to do on their premises. They need to make sure that it's safe on the inside of those premises. And so, for example, if someone like a third party, think customer, injures themselves, and it's the tenant's responsibility to make sure that that didn't happen inside those premises, who's going to be dragged into the lawsuit? The owner of the building. And so this is where the owner of the building says, hey, if you did something that's harmful to a third party and I just happen to get sued for it, I want to be protected under your policy. And that's an insured contract. So when a business rents office space or a warehouse, retail shop, the landlord would typically require them to assume liability for bodily injury or property damage that happens in that lease space, keeping the landlord harmless from lawsuits. It's not saying, hey, tenant, you're going to take on all my liability. It's just saying, if you don't do what you're supposed to do and I get sued because of that, I want to be protected under your policy. Okay, so that's really what it's about. All right, so that is a lease of premises there. So a bakery rents space in a shopping center. The lease says tenant agrees to identify and hold harmless the landlord from any claims of bodily injury or property damage arising out of the use of the leased premises, except for claims caused solely by the landlord's negligence. I love the wording. I wish they all were like that. But, this is what it's talking about here. So if a customer slips on flour near the bakery counter and fractures their wrist, and then what are they going to do? They're going to sue the landlord and the bakery tenant. Okay, so the bakery assumed the responsibility under the lease. And so this is where if the owner were to be sued, they come under this policy and they are protected. Again, additional insured is what we call those in the real world. So this is where, you have this particular situation with a landlord and tenant. Now, there is a separate coverage for fire damage to rented premises. And we're going to talk about that because that's a very important overlooked sublimit there. Now, another insured contract. So easement agreements, an easement is a legal right to use someone else's property. So you may have an easement, for example, a utility company installing a power line across private land. Owner of the land may say, hey, if someone sues me because of something you did, I want to make sure that, I'm protected under your policy. And so you'll see these easement type situations as well. So these are, they're common business arrangements for utilities, municipalities, and contractors. Okay, risk transfer is expected by property owners. And again, this is an insured contract. An elevator maintenance agreement. This is where, for example, a commercial building owner has an elevator in their building. And so they use an elevator company to come in and, do maintenance and repair the elevator. And so they may have an indemnity clause that says lift company agrees to identify and hold harmless the building owner from any claims arising out of inspection, maintenance, repair, except were caused solely by the owner's negligence. And so this is a situation where if a customer were to come in, the customer were to injure themselves in the elevator because of something the elevator company did, and they of course are going to sue the building owner will be protected under their policy. Okay, so again, some different things there that are called insured contracts, and those are okay. Now, who are insureds? When you think about who are insureds in the CGL policy, think about who can be sued. Of course, the named insured, it could be an individual, it could be a partnership, it could be LLC, it could be a corporation. So of course they're going to be an insured. They're protected. There's some other types of insureds you have, like employees, as long as they act within the scope of employment. We're going to talk about forklifts and mobile equipment and things like that. But what if a employee is on a forklift? Think about Sam's Club, Costco. They're on a forklift, they're lifting a pallet. It falls on a customer, it injures them. And, this is where the employee gets sued as well as the business. So the employee would be covered under the policy as long as it's within the acts of employment. Volunteer workers, there's a lot of businesses out there that use volunteers, Salvation Army, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, all of those different types of, especially charity type organizations. And if a volunteer were to, again, be negligent and cause bodily injury and property damage to a third party, and they get sued, they're protected under this policy. Of course, legal reps, and then you have your additional insurers that we talked about. Spouses as well. If a spouse comes into the business and they're working in the business and they were to get sued because they're negligent, they're also protected in this business as well. So you have, those corporations, you have partnerships, you have employees. A bakery employee accidentally spills hot coffee on a customer, and the employee is considered to be an insured. And so this is where the CGL will cover the claim, especially if, they get sued individually. And of course, we have all of our additional insureds, like our tenant and owner type situations there. So when you're talking about who is an insured, it can encompass quite a bit. It could be the named insured, it could be employees, it could be volunteers, it could be a spouse. And again, when you think who is an insured, who can be sued? Who is protected under this policy if they are negligent? Okay, that is who an insured is. Now, the limits in the CGL policy work totally different than they do in auto and homeowners. In auto, you have per accident. In homeowners, you have per occurrence. But what that means is for that particular occurrence, for that particular accident, the company will pay up to those limits. And then what happens? The limits reset themselves and start all over again. So if there's another accident 3 weeks later, the limits have reset themselves. CGL works totally different. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is go over to the whiteboard. And so with the CGL policy, you have what is called a general aggregate. You have a general aggregate, and then you also have over here, think about another aggregate here. Not every business has a products and completed operations aggregate. For example, as an insurance agency, owner, I did not have a products aggregate. Doctors' offices don't have a products aggregate. So when you think about products and completed operations, think restaurants, they have a product. Manufacturers have a product, right? When you're thinking about general aggregates over here, your general aggregate, some examples would be some slips and falls. Your general aggregate could include all your personal injury and advertising claims. Your general aggregate will include medical expenses. And remember, medical expenses are, for example, per person. Okay, so there is a sublimit there. Your general aggregate over here is going to include, slips and falls, personal injury and advertising, medical expenses. Remember that coverage C. It's going to be per person. There's a sublimit. Now, when it comes to another sublimit that's very important is your fire damage legal liability limit. It's a sublimit. And it starts at like 50,000, but you can increase it. So let's say, for example, it is 100,000 here. Okay, now this is your care, custody, and control. It's considered a care, custody, and control limit, and I'm going to talk about that. All right, so you have your general aggregate here. Okay, so and then you also, and again, you may not have both of these aggregates. You also have a products and completed operations aggregate. Of course, restaurants have both of these. Now, right here, think about you have another limit here, and this is called the each occurrence limit. All right, each occurrence limit. Now, your general aggregate, I'm going to give you some limits here just for illustration, maybe 300,000. And your products and completed operations aggregate, we'll put it at 300,000 as well. And then your each occurrence limit can be the same or less. So just for illustration purposes, I'm going to make it a little bit less, 100,000. Okay, now let's say that our first claim here, we have a customer and they come in and they slip and fall. and the slip and fall is 75,000. Okay. And of course, the we'll say the restaurant or the manufacturer is negligent, right? So you have to look at the each occurrence. You just eyeball it. This limit never changes. You look at the each occurrence limit and say, for this occurrence, can I pay, 75,000? Well, yeah, for each occurrence, you can pay up to 100,000. And so we're going to put this, now remember, these policies last for a year. We're going to put this on this side of the equation. So now for this claim, we're going to take 75,000 out of here. And for the year, we only have 225,000 left. Okay, totally different than your homeowners and auto. Now let's say that somebody comes, there's that product and there's a lot of damages that are from a product like a stroller. And so we'll say bodily injury from a product type situation, and we'll say it's 100,000, just to make it a little bit easier here. And so what happens here is, yes, we can pay it for that up to that occurrence. And then you'll have, we'll take it out of the product claim, the product aggregate here. And so that's going to be our number two claim. Now, fire legal liability, what is that? That is a situation that is for tenants, and this is a very much overlooked limit. Fire legal liability is, for example, in our CGL policy, and we're going to talk about exclusions, is they exclude, and it's one of the most litigated exclusions there, care, custody, and control. So anything that's in your care, custody, and control is excluded. So, for example, when I rent a building and I rented my agency, my space, I did not own the building. So I rented and I had approximately 2,000 square feet. And that 2,000 square feet was in my care, custody, and control. And so if I were negligent and I set a fire, you really have this exposure with like dry cleaners and restaurants. But if I were negligent and I set a fire, that part of the building that's in my care, custody, and control is excluded from third party property damage. And so if a tenant sets a fire negligently and they intentionally do it, then the part of their building, that they are renting will go under this sublimit. Okay, because this is care, custody, control. This is a sublimit. And so personally, I raised my limit because I'm kind of a paranoid person with insurance because you hear all these things. I raised my fire damage legal liability limit to $1 million, even though that was way more. And I had a BOP, so my BOP let me do that because I wanted to make sure that if I was negligent and I started a fire for some reason, maybe I had an electrician come in and do some wiring and it sparked a fire, right? Because I had some add-ons with the building that I did. Anything can happen like that. There's always a sublimit here. And so this is very, very important. So for example, if you're a tenant and you are negligent and start a fire and the damage is 50,000, yeah, the max on that, you're going to, instead of looking at these occurrence, you're going to look over here. Okay. And so, yeah, you can pay up to 100,000. So again, this is going to go off of your general aggregate limit. So here we'll take 50,000 and, this is from the legal liability sublimit here. So every claim comes off of your aggregate and you could see how you could run out of limits as a company pretty quickly. That's why it's not uncommon to see, even on BOPs, 2 million aggregates and 1 million each occurrences and then have a commercial umbrella on top of that. Because when it comes to the CGL policy, they're aggregates. They're not each occurrence where they start over. They're not each accident like an auto where they start over. So limits here work totally different. And then you also have to watch these sublimits here. From a standpoint, if you're doing commercial insurance, you really want these medical expense limits to be, maybe 5,000 per person. It kind of keeps, if they're not responsible, but what if the business is legally responsible, but it's not that bad of an injury? It keeps them from suing. So medical expenses and fire damage legal liability are things that are overlooked big time, especially this fire damage legal liability limit here. Okay, because there is a sublimit on there. Okay, so this is where you have, your limits working again, totally different. And very important to put very high limits on any type of business there. All right, so those are your limits there, and I basically described that there for in that slide. So it's not uncommon to see general aggregates and products and completed operations aggregates of 2 million, and then see per occurrence limit of 1 million. Damage to premises rented to you, it starts at usually 100,000. Increase that up. Medical expenses, again, these are two sublimits. Personal advertising is usually you'll see it at 1 million. And again, your each occurrence limits there could be at 1 million. So your aggregates here, very important because as you have a claim, they get subtracted from that. Quickly, let's go over mobile equipment. Mobile equipment is going to be very important when we're comparing business auto with CGL. What is mobile equipment? There's some different types of mobile equipment you could see, like farm machinery, bulldozers, forklifts. It's basically vehicles designed for use principally off the roads. That's really the definition of mobile equipment. What is your covered territory here? Usually means the described territory of the United States of America, Puerto Rico, and Canada. Okay, so two very important terms when it comes to the CGL. What are pollutants? Solid, liquid, gaseous, including smoke, vapor, soot, fumes, chemicals, and waste. Pollutant definition is very important for CGL. Remember, an employee is protected if they get sued. Employees are include a lease worker, but not a temporary worker. A lease worker means a person leased to the name insured by a labor leasing firm. So an employee is protected if they get sued, but remember if they're injured, okay, they're workers' comp. Now, a volunteer is protected as an insured, but a volunteer is not an employee. So the CGL has dual roles when it comes to volunteers. They're not only protected if they get sued, but also if they get injured, they go under CGL because they're not going to be considered an employee. So a volunteer will be protected as an insured. They'll also be protected if they get sued as well.